Hello, my name is Sam Supalla, and I'll be your presenter today. We see the title for the presentation is American Sign Language for Everyone, and I'll also be discussing some considerations for universal design and deaf youth identity. Let's take a look at the next slide. First, I want to discuss the background on ASL proliferation and its effects. Here's the sign for proliferation. There are 2 points that I want to discuss. First, our baby sign programs that have become very popular with parents with hearing children. As the infant gets to become a toddler, oftentimes they become frustrated with their lack of communication with adults, and therefore many parents are supplementing with sign vocabulary to help them communicate better. It seems to be a very popular program. Second, maybe some of you are aware of sign language instruction, which meets the foreign language requirement in many schools where they offer the programs. So we see this in high schools, colleges, and universities all over, and it's a very common practice to happen and very popular over the past 30 years. Regarding the legitimacy of ASL, we know that it is a true language that encompasses deaf culture and opportunities for deaf people. So we see that the stigma related to American Sign Language has decreased over the years. Oftentimes now when we go into stores, we see people who can sign, waitresses who can sign. All of this makes a difference to deaf individuals, and we've seen that happening over the years. So let's look at the next slide. So here we see it says, what more can be done? Is there more that can be done? And I would say yes. ASL proliferation should be for everybody, not necessarily just for some, but for all. Is that possible? Is that something we can expect? I would say I think that's an idea to consider. So here we see discussion about Martha's Vineyard, which was an island off the coast of Massachusetts, where there were more deaf individuals than there are here. And all individuals on the island were able to sign from the 17th, 18th, 19th century up until about the 1950s, when deaf individuals started to be less common on the island. But the point of Martha's Vineyard is that signing was prevalent everywhere, whether you were hearing or deaf, everybody signed. So deaf people felt wonderful. They did not feel discriminated against and felt very equal to all of the residents on the island, whether they went to the post office or were running for office or even policemen on the island. Sign language was something everybody used and was just a really wonderful environment for all who lived on the island. If there were mainlanders coming to the island who were hearing and met a deaf individual and wasn't able to sign, the deaf individual would be a little bit upset about it because it was expected that everybody would sign. Not like nowadays where we meet a hearing person who doesn't sign, deaf people don't necessarily feel good about it but accept it. I don't think that necessarily has to be true. I think Martha's Vineyard can become a model for us today. Now let's turn back the discussion to the concept of universal design. Really, there are 2 points I want to discuss here. Number one is the significance of ramps. Used to be many years ago that steps were very common and not so much ramps. People in wheelchairs started to complain about this in the 1980s, and even though it was going to be very expensive to require ramps to be installed, they were. The fact of the matter is that those of us who walked without wheelchairs were able to benefit from the fact of having a ramp. Whether we were pushing a cart or pushing a baby stroller, we all find that using ramps oftentimes could be very easy for us and an advantage to those who aren't in wheelchairs as well as to those who are in wheelchairs. So we see there's been a significant impact with ramps. And as far as captioning goes, we also see back in the 1980s, it used to be that news channels were captioned, and those were the only programs that were captioned. Deaf individuals complained and got to be where all programs were closed captioned for everybody to enjoy. And we see that now, even when you go to a gym, for example, oftentimes there will be many TVs displayed, and those who are walking on treadmills or exercising are able to watch the TVs. And because there's so many TVs going on at the same time, there's no sound on them, and instead there's captions on all of the TVs. So those who are exercising can go ahead and still read and watch their favorite show. So this is something that benefits those who are hearing as well as those who are deaf. We also see this happening in restaurants and loud bars where volume is turned down and instead closed captioning is turned on. So again, everybody can benefit from this. So my question is, can ASL follow along this same path where everybody benefits from its use and not just those who are deaf? It's important for us now to keep a few things in mind. Historically, we've seen some issues related to schools for the deaf, for example, being closed, and numbers of attendees into these schools have declined. Many people have complained about this, and especially the fact, where and how are deaf individuals, students, able to communicate with each other? This has become a really big issue. Also along the same lines is, where are these students using sign language, and who are they using sign language with? Oftentimes, if they're in isolated programs, they don't have any communication with other deaf students. So research is showing that sign language and use of sign language is really deteriorating. In the past, many students would go and attend schools for the deaf, and they'd be able to socialize and continue with their sign language use. Now, with the advance of cochlear implants, oftentimes sign language is withheld from students in hopes that the cochlear implant will take over and students will no longer need American Sign Language. But recent studies showed that this can be very harmful to the deaf students, and any medical act where they're putting in, for example, a cochlear implant and then withholding sign language is going to hurt the student. So obviously just putting in the cochlear implant doesn't turn them into a hearing individual, but we need to consider these ethics. Is it appropriate to withhold sign language from these students and try to really just focus on improving their speaking abilities? So again, this is something important to keep in mind. Can universal design help with this and make it a little bit more appropriate for deaf students? So here we see, we're going to look at the definition of universal design. And basically, it says that typically products or things are created for the average user. And other people who might not be average users, for example, deaf people, are excluded from this concept. Wheelchair users are excluded from this concept. But the definition of universal design says instead of looking at products, perhaps we can change the environment to benefit all people and really maximize for all users instead of being specific to a special group or just having a special design. Universal design wants to make things accessible and user-friendly for all individuals. Let's look at the next slide. Here we see the definition of universal design being expanded a little bit more. So obviously the idea of ramps is kind of iconic with universal design, and that's related to architecture, architectural changes. But here we see that perhaps the definition of universal design can be expanded a little bit. For example, looking beyond just architecture and looking within, for example, a university and seeing how we can change within the university to benefit from everybody and not just looking at architectural details to benefit. So this is an expanded look or expanded definition of universal design. So here we have a weakness associated with universal design. So the universal design principles are important to remember, that we're supposed to be serving those needs of all. However, here we see that perhaps sometimes with deaf students, they're going to need a sign language interpreter because universal design doesn't meet their needs. So offering a sign language interpreter would be considered an accommodation for this deaf student. So obviously that's not something that would be appropriate for UD, but just appropriate to this specific student. So we see the sign language interpreters again used as an accommodation. However, I disagree. I feel that universal design is very important. We see in this quote that Bergstaller, who is a disabilities scholar, made this comment, and looking at this comment, interpret it as you mean, so because society is a speaking society, that we have to accept the fact they're speaking and that we're not. I know, for example, myself, and I'm sure you do, many hearing individuals who use sign language and can sign. Even though they can hear fine, it's not complicated for them to learn American Sign Language. Obviously, for me as a deaf individual, it's be very difficult for me to be able to speak. So by saying you can just provide a sign language interpreter that resolves the problem, I feel like universal design is kind of stopped short. We need to look at universal design and how we can provide ASL proliferation, as we discussed earlier, with baby sign, with American Sign Language classes, with using Martha's Vineyard as an example. I still believe universal design can be the best alternative. So we have to somehow correct what is commonly thought in society. For example, ASL is not considered a product in the eyes of universal design. It's more overlooked. Secondly, creating a signing environment is also something that universal design overlooks. So because spoken language is still superior, or autism, as it's termed, is superior and accepted in society, that causes a problem for deaf individuals. So I really believe that we need to take the concept of universal design and move forward with it as far as we can. Now we're going to look at proposed universal design and the deaf community's perspective. Remember, we talked about expanding the notion of universal design beyond architectural. So now we have to let everybody know what it is we want from universal design. And I think the idea for everybody to use American Sign Language is what we should say. We should say that is what we want, for everybody to use American Sign Language. Remember, we talked about mainstreaming in schools and how students for the deaf were isolated? Perhaps deaf schools could offer reverse integration where they become sign language schools and hearing students could enroll in the sign language schools if they chose to do so. Obviously, there would still be public schools that were spoken language, and we would have both options. What's important here is teaching reading to deaf students and really looking at the curriculum, instruction, and assessments and making any changes that would allow deaf students to learn how to read. In the past, it's been very difficult for deaf students to learn how to read based on phonology and sound-based. So it's been very difficult, and now we need to make some adjustments to the curriculum that would make it easier for deaf students to learn how to read through American Sign Language by offering special tools and procedures that would help them use American Sign Language to learn how to read. Now, suppose there were a deaf student who were mainstreamed in a hearing school program. We would need to watch that deaf student and really assess them. And if they aren't able to learn how to read based on their methodology, then we would need to refer them to a sign language school where we would know what to do with that deaf student. So again, they would have the option of both. As far as sign language classes, I really think we need to really, again, encourage them in schools all across the country, and not just as a foreign language option alongside Spanish or French, where they would choose a language over the other. Now I believe we should really allow American Sign Language to be a core course taught alongside math and English and science, and something that's required for all students to learn. If this were to happen, once students were to graduate and they would be out in the world and they would meet a deaf person, they would be able to sign with them. And perhaps you'd find some hearing people who would really want to immerse themselves and go to a sign language school to learn even more sign language, and that would be an option for them as well. But again, just noting that American Sign Language would be required. It's interesting looking at Gallaudet University, they're already doing that. They're famous for serving deaf students for many years. It's a college in Washington, D.C., but now back in 2001, they started admitting hearing students into the university using a screening program and an interview program, but those who are really anxious to use sign language all day are invited and welcome to come in. It's a smaller percentage, but it's still allowed. There are also charter schools that have that serve many deaf students all across the nation that also let hearing students in. Of course, with those hearing students, they must use sign language. So again, deaf community and all of our activism is something we need to consider, this concept of universal design and how we can really implement it to its fullest. And now we're going to talk about insights from New Zealand, and we can really learn a lot from what's happening in New Zealand. They've been very ambitious with sign language. For example, in 2006, they recognized and passed a law that New Zealand Sign Language is the third official language. They have their first spoken language. They also have Maori, which is another language, a European language that is spoken in New Zealand, and that's an official language. And then third is New Zealand Sign Language, which is an official language. The government and the Department of Education was very excited and anxious to add this and make sure that all hearing people in New Zealand are learning sign language. So it seems very similar to what happened in Martha's Vineyard, to where everybody in New Zealand would know sign language. And that's very exciting. And last, I want to talk a little bit about history and the deaf community and some examples of universal design that we've seen in the history of deaf individuals. So let's take a look at a couple examples. So here we see the book that came out in the 1930s called The Deaf Mute Howls, and it was written by a deaf man named Albert Ballin. And he brought up several interesting ideas that all hearing individuals should be signers. And he himself actually met Charlie Chaplin. You see it in one of the pictures, who was a famous Hollywood actor back in the day. And you see that he was learning how to gesture or sign a little bit with also Granville Medlin, who is a famous painter, and also did some acting in some of Charlie Chaplin's films. And he was always very impressed with deaf individuals and their facial expression, because obviously silent movies had no speaking, so they had captioning, and it was always nice to use individuals who had great expression. So I know Charlie Chaplin seemed to be very motivated by hiring deaf individuals. And Albert, he was also very excited to meet deaf individuals and those who could sign, and again realized it was so much easier with using them. Again, the idea of universal design, being able to use deaf individuals for everybody to benefit, that was just a great idea. Here's another famous example of a baseball player, a professional baseball player, Dummy Hoy. If you remember, there was a DVD recently released about his life. He traveled the world, was a famous professional baseball player. And the story with him goes that we'd have the referees with the catcher's masks and wouldn't be able to be hearing what they were yelling. And so Dummy Hoy taught them several signs. So then they were able to use some of these signs to indicate what was happening, because Dummy couldn't hear them. So again, everybody was able to benefit from the notion of using these gestures and signs, because perhaps they wouldn't be able to hear them. So Dummy Hoy was recognized for doing that. And so again, this is another example, a limited example, but an example of universal design and how it can benefit more than just those who are deaf. And this last point is very important, the implications for deaf youth identity. Obviously, communication and language is so important for humans. And for deaf students, sign language is just as equal as spoken language is, and we really need to encourage that and make them feel strong with their convictions with sign language, help them to socialize with everybody and not always rely on interpreters to sign or interpret for them. We need to have deaf youth really pick up on their identity, increase their feeling of being deaf. And sign language and a sign language environment is one way to do it. Instead of overlooking that, we really have to recognize how important this is for deaf youth. And also to help deaf youth grow up and really have a strong sense of self-identity. And as they see more and more hearing people using sign language, they feel better about themselves because they realize that they're using the same language, and that's a good thing. So in conclusion, there's a couple recommendations that I'd like to close with. So we've seen and discussed the concept of universal design. Number one, ASL needs to be recognized for use in the environment all over society. Number two, I think we need to recognize that ASL is a product that all people can benefit from. And obviously, we know that deaf individuals can benefit from American Sign Language, but also hearing individuals can really benefit from American Sign Language. Several examples are when they're trying to communicate through a window, for example. If they used sign language, they'd be able to use that. We've seen parents using baby sign language with their toddlers, and again, helping the families. And Also, the elderly, as they start to lose their hearing, there's a big impact on their language and abilities. A lot of times they become isolated, withdrawn because of their hearing kind of disappearing. So we see more and more people living to be at an older age, and they really could benefit from the use of American Sign Language, especially as they lose their hearing. So again, those are several ideas where we see a huge benefit to both hearing and deaf individuals. Third, the notion of autism is something that we really challenge, and we really need to shift our attitudes and change it to be more positive. And the notion of autism needs to kind of fade away. Fourth, remember I talked a little bit about using American Sign Language in places where it's hard to hear. Also, we have to know more about deaf culture and just the history of deaf individuals and how sign language came to be. All of that is just a rich experience for individuals as they learn to use American Sign Language. Obviously, for hearing individuals, it'd be a secondary language, but for deaf individuals, their primary language, and all of the benefits that come along with learning another language is important for us to consider and keep in mind. Fifth, the notion of American Sign Language and universal design is truly a benefit for both hearing and deaf people. Just as we saw in Martha's Vineyard, we see that language really can be a universal design. Another notion is when we see deaf and blind individuals, we see that sign language itself is still used for communication. So as far as human beings go, even if they're blind, they're able to use American Sign Language. And obviously deaf individuals and then hearing individuals who have no hearing impairment are able to learn, use, and benefit from American Sign Language. Any spoken language really and truly is limited to those who can hear and not quite as universal in design as ASL is.